Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses some potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rodgers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're discussing the EMS Compact program. Joining me on the program today is Donnie Woodyard, and Donnie is the Executive Director of EMS Personnel Practice. He's joining us today to discuss the details of EMS Compact and how it could impact your emergency services organization. Donnie, it's great to have you on the program today, and I really appreciate your time.
Hey, it's a joy to be here. I really do appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Before we get into the questions about the EMS Compact, can you give the listeners a little background of your history in EMS?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, I've been in EMS now a little over 30 years. I started out actually as a volunteer EMT in Virginia, and then kind of transitioned to a number of different states as I was doing college and university and career. Became a paramedic and critical care paramedic and worked internationally for about 10 years. But back in the U.S., I was the state director in Louisiana and Colorado, and also previously served as the chief operating officer at the National Registry of EMTs before joining the EMS Compact in this role as the executive director about 2 years ago.
That sounds like you've been around the block just a little bit. A few states that I cover, and a lot of experience on your side of the fence there.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Good to hear. Good to hear. So let's get into the meat of the conversation. You mentioned the EMS Compact. So can you go into, what the EMS Compact is?
Yeah, absolutely. So the EMS Compact is at the core, it's an interstate compact, and we can talk about that a little bit more, I hope. But the EMS Compact allows for the mobility of EMS clinicians across state lines and across jurisdictions on the basis of being licensed in one state. They're given a privilege to practice where they can now operate in 25 different states in the United States with no additional license required. The compact also aligns state government agencies together under a unified vision and a unified process for personnel licensure and discipline and advancing the EMS system.
So it sounds like in an industry where we're having a shortage of personnel, it's giving us some more options to have those folks move around where they're needed.
It really is. I mean, one of the key things with the compact was to really reduce bureaucracy, reduce the red tape. We recognize that EMS is just by nature, by design, it's a very mobile field. I mean, I mentioned even in my intro, I started out in Virginia as an EMT, and 2 years later, I was in Ohio for college. And again, this was 30 some years ago, but I get there, I'm like, hey, I want to work as an EMT. And they're like, oh, great. We need you to go back to school. And so I had to go back and repeat a lot of my education and jump through a lot of hoops. And, did I learn anything new? No, I didn't. It was really the same thing. I just had to repeat it. So it was a waste. And so what the EMS Compact does is really reduce those barriers of bureaucracy and allows for easy mobility of EMS personnel.
Sounded like you were dealing with the Department of Redundancy department a little bit when you were switching states. So you mentioned earlier that you wanted to go into interstate compacts. Can you elaborate on what interstate compacts are?
Yeah, and I can nerd out on this just a little bit because they're really a fascinating part of really the United States and what we enjoy every day. So really at the foundation, the concept of compacts goes back to the colonial days, even before we had a constitution. So we had the 13 different colonies, and they were sovereign. These colonies had their own government structures, but they quickly realized that they had to figure out items that impacted multiple colonies that no single colony had jurisdiction over. And some of that could be as simple as like, how do you use a river or water rights? But there are other more complicated issues. Well, the mechanism that they came up with that ended up actually being written into the Constitution, and it's what's called the Compact Clause of the Constitution. And so it preserves state sovereignty. It respects federal authority, but it recognizes that there's a whole lot of items that really expand beyond a single state border, but there is no federal authority for it. Let me give a quick example. A driver's license is a very common tool that we use. And in fact, I'm sure most of our listeners with a driver's license have at some point driven across the state line. Well, when you think about that, say that I have a driver's license issued by the state of Colorado. Colorado has no jurisdiction if I cross into Kansas or Wyoming or Utah. But at the same time, we do it every single day. So how does that happen? There's no federal driver's license either. The way that happens is that states have came together. They've entered into contractual agreements where the states have said, hey, this is the requirements for you to get a driver's license. This is how we're going to exchange data about driver's license. And by the way, we're going to say that if you are granted a license in one state, we're going to recognize that in another state immediately. And we're going to build in mechanisms for accountability and data sharing. So at the core, that's what compacts are. In fact, that's a driver's license compact. Another compact that's probably real common for EMS that we don't think about is EMAC, the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. Again, that's a compact that's been entered into by all 50 states. And it basically says in a time of disaster, we're going to streamline a mechanism of moving resources. So those are a couple examples of compacts. But, we use them for everything from airports and transit authorities to insurance and education and water rights. So they're a really common underpinning of how we enjoy 50 individual states in one United States, and it allows interoperability.
So you mentioned that that's used in different avenues. Are there different aspects of healthcare and emergency services outside of EMS where occupational licensure compacts are used?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So right now there are about 17 occupational compacts, and the majority of the 17 are medical related compacts. So some of the more common ones that people may have heard about is the nursing compact. There's a physical therapy compact. There's a physician compact. There's a psychology compact and counseling compact and physician assistant compact. I mean, there's a ton of these compacts out there. EMS, however, was one of the early compacts for the occupational and health field. The nursing compact and physician compact predates us, but we served as a model of this immediate recognition, privilege to practice model that's now been kind of replicated in a lot of the other medical professions. So we had a chance to kind of help pave the way for others in medicine to really explore how cross-border and mobility are important for today's healthcare workforce.
Nice. Great to hear. Earlier in your comments, you mentioned that I think 24 or there might be 25 states now that are part of the compact. Why aren't all 50 states part of the EMS compact?
Yeah, let me just do a quick shout out. So Arkansas just last week passed the compact law. And I probably should revisit what that means in another comment here. But so now we have 25 states. But you have a great question of why are not all 50 states part of the compact? It really comes down to a few things. One is, there's a lot going on in EMS right now. We recognize, in fact, the latest CMS report just came out that said of $22 billion of expenses for Medicare, $9 billion of that was unreimbursed. And we're not even talking about profits. We're talking about $9 billion and $22 billion was unreimbursed expense for just caring for Medicare patients. So there's a lot going on in the EMS sphere that requires legislative effort. Oftentimes, EMS doesn't have the strongest set of advocates and lobbyists. We have a difficult time getting legislation on the agenda. And frankly, in some states, when it comes down to, hey, what do we need to focus our lawmakers on in the world of EMS? Things like, financing and how do I keep an agency open rises to the top of the list. And they just run out of time to entertain compact or other important legislation. So that's probably number one. Number two is, this is still relatively new. Even though we've been doing this 10 years, there's still a lot of people who don't understand how compacts work. And it's not something that is common to the EMS profession. So it's something new. A lot of people are still just not aware that, hey, there's a compact out there that can really help things with the workforce and license mobility and portability. So lack of awareness would be another issue.
So you mentioned that, a lack of awareness. Can you kind of give us from a historical perspective, kind of that 10 years ago, how it started to kind of where we are today?
Yeah. So if you go back to 2011, 2012, actually the Department of Homeland Security had recognized that because EMS is so mobile and there's so many federal employees and federal agents that are EMS providers, that they really had a challenge on how do you ensure that they are operating and respecting state sovereignty of licensure without having to have, these federal EMS personnel literally carrying 50 state licenses. And so they started working with NASIMSO, the Association of State EMS Officials, and they said, hey, let's explore a project here of using a compact to actually establish some standards in cross-border mobility. So they put together a working group and a stakeholder group, and then that involved broad numbers of organizations and stakeholders from EMS community. And then they came together and said, yep, this is a good idea. And then there was a drafting team put together that involved both stakeholders and lawyers and legal counsels. And they drafted what's called the model legislation. And that was finished in 2013. And then it took 2 years on legislative cycles. And in 2015, Colorado was the first state. Shortly, a few days later, Texas was the second state to actually pass the legislation. And then really over the next few years, it was about getting more states to pass the legislation. Real quick, I need to just clarify that with the compact, at the core, it is model legislation. So compacts, the way you enter into a compact is, I often tell people, think about it as a contract that's entered into between two states. And the way they do that is they pass a state law. And that state law, because it's a contract as well as a compact, it's got to be the same language. So that's where we use this model legislation. So every state passes the same exact legislation. It becomes part of state law. And then that's what enables a state to join the compact. Obviously, all of that takes time. It takes time to draft the legislation and get it through and do the advocacy work required. Which is why today with 25 states, while it might seem a little bit slow, it's actually a pretty good pace when it comes to getting legislation passed in that number of states.
Hey, it's hard to get that many people to agree that the sky is blue on a sunny day. So I imagine with this many moving parts, it's probably a lot of work to just to get those 25 states rolling as we have it right now.
Oh, absolutely. And as I mentioned, it's model legislation. So, that's something else that is kind of unique for lawmakers. So, anyone that's watched legislation go through the process, you get someone who says, hey, I think we need a law or a bill that addresses this issue. And then they draft it. And then it goes back and forth between the different chambers and different committees. And there's amendments and changes. And at the end, the final piece of legislation often looks quite different than how it started. However, with compact legislation, it has to remain the same. And so, that's another kind of learning curve that we really had to tackle in the early days. Now, because there are so many compacts out there related to occupational medical licensure, our legislators are learning that. But that was another big learning curve we had to work through.
So can you go into what are some of the key features of the EMS compact? I'll start off with one based off your answers. It seems like there's a improved or enhanced state cooperation. Can you elaborate on some of the key features of the compact?
Yeah, and I really do appreciate that we're starting there. So certainly the compact is about mobility and moving people, but one of the most important parts of the compact is that via state law, it actually says that states that are members of the compact shall cooperate. And then the compact lists 7 areas that the states are bound to cooperate in. And so again, this is state law that's directing the state EMS office to cooperate in the areas of increasing public access to EMS personnel. The states are required to cooperate around how do we protect and enhance health and safety and patient safety. So how can we work together as 25 states to improve patient safety? That's very important. We have to cooperate in the area of personnel licensure and regulation. Just like I mentioned, 30 years ago, traveling between states, it was different requirements. But the compact clears that up and says, no, we're going to collaborate and make sure that we have uniform standards. Just like we have uniform standards to get a driver's license that all states have adopted, the compact has uniform standards for licensure. It also includes expedited licensure for military and veterans and their spouses. So the compact includes that. And then another core aspect is the exchange of data and information. And that's really one of the important parts of the compact. It's 2025. And one of the questions that people are always shocked when I'm talking about is the simple question of how many EMTs and paramedics do we have in the United States today? And you know what? No one can answer that question. Literally, there's no answer to that question. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And, I'm licensed right now in 4 different states. So if you just call each state and say, how many paramedics do you have? I'm going to be counted at least 4 times. There are people out there with 20 or 30 different licenses that they're counted multiple times. The compact, through the law, has a data system that actually deduplicates all this data so that we can get an accurate count. And luckily, now we have 25 states as part of that. So the compact really brings so much more than just mobility of personnel. It really is about advancing the entire EMS profession in a unified way.
So can you elaborate on the privilege to practice concept, how that is evolves from the enhanced state cooperation?
Yeah, so the privilege to practice is, from an operational perspective, probably the most important part of the operations of the compact. So at the core, I'm going to use me as an example. Again, I've already noted I'm a licensed paramedic in Colorado. And because of the compact, my license is now valid in all 25 states. But that doesn't mean I can just show up and individually practice. There is no individual practice in EMS. So I like to tell people, yep, I'm licensed here in Colorado, but I currently, I'm an administrator right now. I don't have an EMS agency at the moment. I don't have a medical director. So I can't just walk out on the street with a sign that says Donnie Paramedic Service, right? I think we all understand and agree with that.
Right.
So what the compact does is it says you have to be with an authorized agency with a medical director. Now, here's the thing. Any EMS agency in Colorado could hire me today. They could, send me through their onboarding process, and I could start working tonight if they were fast enough. Through the compact, any agency in any of the 25 states could do the same thing. They could hire me today, paid or unpaid, it doesn't matter. They could hire me today, send me through their onboarding process, and I could literally start working tonight, assuming that I completed their standard onboarding, whatever that is. So the compact extends your license privilege across all 25 states. It removes that barrier. It removes the bureaucracy, but it really does preserve the state's ability to actually regulate EMS and to for accountability.
Well, you mentioned regulation, and that's something I want to follow up on. Since we're spanning across 25 states, who oversees the program, or is the governing body? Because we have 25 states, and we need kind of one set of a standardized approach to for these people to go work in each state. So who is the governing body that oversees this?
Yeah, so the law that's passed in each state creates a new government entity, and that government entity is the Interstate Commission for EMS Personnel Practice. And it's that commission that is the government body with the authority to oversee the multi-state practice of EMS in the United States. Now, there's a few unique parts of that I want to just point out. So the governor of each member state, via the law, appoints one commissioner. And that commissioner is charged with representing the interests of that state. And the law actually specifies it should be the state EMS director or someone in the executive branch of government responsible for the licensure of EMS personnel. So it's someone who is responsible for licensing EMS personnel in that state. So we have 25 of those commissioners. Those commissioners come together to form the commission, and that is the government body. Now, it's important to note that the commission is charged with cooperation between states and coordinating and the interstate practice of EMS. But when an individual is practicing in any individual state, even under the compact, because of state sovereignty, that state EMS office is the one that actually adjudicates any local issues that happen. And that's very important because the compact really does preserve that local state authority on the individual practice level while encouraging and mandating collaboration and communication and information sharing at the macro level of the system.
Earlier you mentioned that you could be listed 4 times as a paramedic, so it's hard to for us to really figure out exactly how many paramedics we have across the country. Is that one of the goal of the compact? Is to have a national EMS coordinated database?
In fact, it is, and that is part of the law itself. So the law established this government database. And this data system requires every member state to connect their licensure system to the centralized licensure data system. And it's a very secure system. It's a government mandated, government controlled system. But what it does in near real time through an API, so it's almost instantaneous, is when someone gets licensed in a state, that record goes through what we call an identity server, and it says, okay, here's John Smith. Do we have any other John Smiths that match? And then we do this complicated matching algorithm. So we look at not only the name, but name and birth date and demographic information and addresses, but we make sure it's the same John Smith. And then we can match John Smith in state 1, state 2, state 3, national registry information. So we can match that in this one centralized system. And then when a state EMS official wants to learn about John Smith through the centralized system, they can see, oh, here's John Smith's license in Colorado, and Texas, and Louisiana, and Virginia, and it's all on one screen. And that's very, very important. Now, the other thing that's important is while most of EMS is absolutely amazing, honorable people, and I'm blessed to have built my life in EMS, we all know that occasionally with any field, there are some bad actors out there. And what this system does is if someone has their license that is suspended, revoked, or sanctioned after a due process, that gets reported to this database, and it actually notifies all the other states that, hey, John Smith's license just got revoked. Now, again, I said at the beginning, state sovereignty is so important. So the compact preserves that. So if John Smith is licensed in another state and he gets revoked in a different state, it's still the decision of the state to revoke the additional license or to sanction it or not. Now, what the compact does is it removes the compact privilege if there's discipline. So you can't practice in other states under your license, under your compact privilege. But if you have a license issued by another state, that state still has the authority to keep it, grant it, revoke it, or remove it. So it really increases public protection while uniquely preserving a state's authority to regulate EMS at the local level.
So beyond workforce mobility, what is the broader purpose of the EMS compact?
Yeah, it really is about coming up with a unified system for EMS. It's about removing bureaucracy. It's about streamlining the process. It's about making sure that EMS clinicians who desire to actually work can be matched with an employer paid or unpaid, that needs their services. And let me just paint this vision for you. Imagine that you are, in your young 20s and you're a brand new paramedic, and like in my 20s, I traveled the world. I worked in EMS, but I traveled the world. And so imagine that you want to do that. Well, the EMS Compact opens up this whole new opportunity for you. You could work in an urban, fast-paced city environment. And then if you wanted to, you could go and affiliate and maybe say, you know what, I want to be a ski medic out in Colorado during the wintertime. And I want to do some hiking in, Wyoming or Idaho in the fall. And the EMS Compact actually would allow you to do that pretty quickly. And so you can have workforce mobility. And instead of people leaving the workforce, they could stay in it. They could explore new opportunities. It also allows for things like surge events. Burning Man is a great example. This past year, for the Burning Man, that event literally brings in hundreds of EMS personnel. And it brings in EMS personnel from all across the nation. Well, the state office this year, because they're part of the compact, had a very streamlined process. Rather than having to get a local license for a 2-week event, they were simply able to just come in and work on their home state license. And it really saves time and bureaucracy and frustration for everyone, from the state EMS office to the individual. So that's just some of the core functions of it. But I think the other thing is, again, that coordination amongst states. Just a few months ago, the commission released a position paper that discussed doxing and data security for EMS personnel. And this is a collective paper now representing 25 states on how we should protect the licensure data for EMS clinicians from nefarious actors and foreign governments that might be trying to target it. This is the first time any work like that's ever been done for EMS clinicians. So it really is a broad advancement of the profession from both individuals through the profession as a whole that the commission is working on.
So does the compact, this is a mouthful, does the compact impact the EMS scope of practice?
Ooh. Not directly. So the scope of practice is set through the individual states, and part of the state law, again, it respects that state sovereignty. And so the way that the scope of practice works is your scope of practice is your home state, and I should probably clarify, a home state is the state that issues you a license, and you can actually have more than one home state. So I've got multiple home states. So any state that issues you a license is a home state. So when you're working in a remote state, that's a state that you're not licensed in using your privilege, you operate under your home state scope of practice until it's modified by what we call an appropriate authority in the remote state. Let me put that into an example that's probably easier to understand.
Okay.
Let's say that I'm working with a local ambulance service here in Colorado, and where I'm living right now, and say that I get, a patient, and I pick them up, and I'm close to the border with Kansas, and I have to drop that patient off in Kansas. Well, obviously, I'm not going to change my scope of practice just because they're across the state border. So I'm going to follow my home state scope of practice and continue that care all the way to that patient's dropped off. But let's do a separate scenario. Let's say that I'm still living here in Colorado, but I decide I'm going to work for an agency in Wyoming. Maybe it's a surge event. Maybe it's a part-time job. Maybe I'm, going to just work up there for a longer term to fill a void. When I do that, it only makes sense that I follow the scope of practice for the new agency that I'm working for. And so in that scenario, I would follow the scope of practice for Wyoming, and I would follow the scope of practice of that agency and medical director. So the easiest way to answer the scope of practice is you follow the scope of practice for the agency that you're working for under the protocols approved by your physician medical director. And as a professional, it's your responsibility to identify and close any gaps that may exist.
So let's kind of pivot to adverse actions. What if there's something that happens that requires a disciplinary action? Is that something that the compact gets involved with, or are you all strictly sharing information between members?
So the compact does not adjudicate the action. The compact commissioners, the state EMS office within the state where the action happened, they're the ones that's actually going to adjudicate it. But what the compact does is it facilitates the exchange of that information. So under the compact law, and through the mechanism of the government body of the commission, the states can now share and cooperate in investigations. And this is actually very important for public protection. We know that, patients are mobile, EMS is mobile, and, state lines, just because you have to cross the state line, it doesn't mean that you just stop patient care. So the compact allows for the sharing of information, including investigations between states. It allows for the subpoenaing of information, and it really requires that cooperation. Now, what happens is, say that I'm working in a remote state. So I'm working on my privilege to practice, and I violate a state law, and it results in an investigation. So that state can immediately suspend or revoke my privilege to practice. And when one state does that, it turns off that privilege for the entire compact. So if I am revoked, suspended in one state, my compact privilege is no longer valid in any state until that's resolved. And that's a public protection issue. And then that state will do the investigation, and then they will send the investigation and notify the state that issued the license. And then that state, whoever issued the license, will review the file and make a determination and follow the due legal process for doing any discipline against the license. Think about it like this. Think about if I'm driving in a different state and I get pulled over and I'm issued a speeding ticket. If it's a minor ticket, yeah, I'm going to pay whatever fine it is and go on my merry way, but it's going to be reported to my home state. And that might impact my driver's license points. It might impact my insurance, even though I got a ticket outside of where I live. If it was a bad enough issue and I'm in a remote state driving, they can take me to jail. They can lock me up. They could even send me to prison, right? And that home state then could revoke my driver's license. So the EMS privilege works very, very similar to that.
So over the number of years that you've worked in this program, I'm sure that you've seen some myths and misunderstandings. Are there any myths or misunderstandings that you'd like to address to listeners that might have some questions about the compact program?
Yeah, we hear a number of myths and misunderstandings, and some of the more common ones that we've heard is that the commission is some, association or non-government body or some NGO. And well, as we've already talked about, well, that's not true. The commission is a government body, and not only a government body. Currently in the United States, the Compact Commission is the highest regulatory government body in the United States for the practice of EMS. I often hear people talk about, EMS has no centralized point of like regulation in the United States. Well, now we do, and we have 25 states as part of it. So that's one myth. The second myth, misunderstanding, is related to financing. Different compacts have different models, and it depends on how the law is written. But the EMS compact has no financial incentives. There's no pay required from either the state or the individual. And that's very important. So the commission does not charge the state, nor does the commission charge the individual for the privilege to practice. In fact, the privilege to practice is automatic. There is no application. There is no paperwork. There's no process for you to request it. It is literally automatic. When you're licensed in a compact state, through the data system, you are automatically given a privilege to practice that can be validated at our website, emscompact.gov, as a government website. So that's another myth that's out there, is related to the finances, which is very important.
So, one final question to wrap up our conversation today. Can you talk about the future goals of the compact, as well as, it's also a goal, how you intend to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first and foremost is, now that we do have 25 states, we would love to get all 50 states. And one of these days, hopefully that's possible. But even with 25 states, what our focus is on right now is making sure that all of the employers, all the EMS clinicians, which is over 400,000, all the EMS agencies in these 25 states, we want to make sure that they, one, know about the compact, and two, understand how it works. I was recently having a conversation with a paramedic, and this paramedic told me just yesterday that, yeah, my employer doesn't really trust that the compact works. And I have 10 different licenses because of that. Boy, that's just tragic to hear. So, really our goal is to educate, let people know that, this is state law. It's very powerful state law. And it's state law that, has went through the entire process. It's been deliberated. It's been signed by the governor. And 400,000 EMS clinicians have a valid privilege to practice in 25 states now, and that's massive for workforce development. Number two is we really want to enhance the database. Right now, the database is connected to most of the 25 states. We still have a few states that are on outdated licensure systems. And so because they joined the compact, they're going to have to update their technology. And in fact, there's still one state that predominantly uses paper applications. So the compact is helping to advance the profession, and we want to get the states on modern licensure data systems so that everyone can fully enjoy that privilege. But beyond that, we want to make sure that we expand our data system to meet the needs of employers. Let me highlight this. Employers know that despite their best efforts, sometimes people simply, unfortunately, let their EMS license expire and they continue to take care of patients. Well, that just translates into insurance reversions and fines. It's very expensive. So the compact wants to make sure that we can develop a system that will allow employers to essentially upload their roster and get push notifications anytime someone on their roster goes from an eligible status to an expired or ineligible status, be it by natural expiration or by discipline. So that's really a priority of ours right now, is to make sure that we are giving that value add back to the community. And in doing so, we think that we can literally help save millions of dollars from fines and insurance repayments. And by the way, it's much better for patient care and patient safety and for the public.
One quick follow-up. If we have a 26th state out there that's listening, what's the process for them to sign up to, maybe become the 26th compact state?
Ultimately, it requires the passing of that legislation. We have that legislation on our website. It's just called the model legislation for the EMS compact. But, apart from the mechanics of passing it, I think it's very important to highlight the how and the process. And it always starts at the local level with local stakeholders. And so the difference between the legislation passing in the 25 states and where it has not really comes down to, it takes local stakeholders who say this is important, and they champion the cause. They show up for the committee hearings, and EMS has to be represented in the state house so that the legislators understand this is a priority for the system, and it's a priority for them to spend their time on. So that's really the important next step. Our office, and I'm available. I'm happy to come and talk to anyone because we are a government agency. I don't lobby. I can't lobby, but I can certainly help answer questions and get resources. And, we're even happy to provide an in-service similar to this for Con Ed for your EMS personnel. And it does count for research hours in the operations section of research. And so we're happy to do that and just help increase the knowledge and the word about the compact.
Well, Donnie, it's something that you're obviously very passionate about and very knowledgeable about. I think we're on 41st minute of the conversation, so it's been and we've just been going back and forth. So a lot of information. So that's great that you're willing to reach out to the guests and have a one-on-one with them if they're interested in doing it. So Donnie, I appreciate you joining us today, and it was a pleasure chatting with you. And I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Donnie. And I want to thank you for listening to the program and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guest, Donnie Woodyard, once again for his time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by emailing VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees. Additionally, all views, information, or opinions expressed are provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, medical, or other professional advice on any subject matter.